I often imagine impossible encounters, dialogues that transcend the boundaries of space and time. As an old professor of philosophy, having spent a lifetime with the yellowed pages of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, I find I have a strange privilege to live in worlds created by thought. In my own world, the great thinkers do not lie quietly in their tombs or on lifeless pages. They sit in Viennese coffee houses, stroll along the shores of Lake Geneva, or simply appear in a fleeting dream, where an unfinished question of this century might find its answer from a mind of the last. And the encounter I cherish most, the one I often return to on sleepless nights of contemplation, is the dialogue between Karl Marx and Albert Einstein. One sought to decipher the laws of motion of human society. The other wished to lift the veil of mystery from the universe. One used history as his laboratory. The other, the stars, as his subject of observation. They were, in their own unique ways, both materialists. They believed in an objective reality, existing independently of human consciousness. But matter in their eyes took on entirely different forms and melodies. Imagine an autumn afternoon in Bern, Switzerland, around the year 1905. The city still retained its ancient, solemn beauty. Outside the window of a small cafe on Cram Gas, yellow leaves twirled in the gentle breeze. Inside, a man with a distinct bushy beard and hair, already touched with silver, yet whose eyes still shone with a sharp fire, sat pensively over a cold cup of coffee. It was Karl Marx, a specter from the past, a thinker who seemed to have stepped right out of his own books. He did not belong here, yet his presence felt strangely appropriate. His gaze wasn't on the newspaper on the table, but seemed to penetrate the walls. Observing the flow of life, outside workers leaving their shifts, ladies strolling, horse-drawn carriages clattering by, and the first automobiles rattling noisily. Every movement, every sound was data for his unceasingly analytical mind. The cafe door opened softly. A young man entered. His hair was artistically disheveled. His eyes had a dreamy quality but concealed an extraordinary focus. He wore a simple, somewhat worn suit. This was Albert Einstein, a humble clerk at the patent office, a name the world did not yet know. He chose a table near the window, ordered a tea, and gazed absently outside. His eyes didn't follow the people, but seemed to chase a beam of light reflecting off the glass. A beam that, in his mind, was traveling at a constant, immutable speed. Silence filled the space between the two strangers, but it was a silence pregnant with thought. Marx, with his habit of observing people, glanced at the young man. He saw in him a detachment from the mundane material world, an immersion in abstract contemplation. It intrigued him, and in a way, challenged him. "A fine day to ponder eternity, isn't it, young man?" Marx spoke, his voice deep with an old German accent. Einstein started, turning to look at the man with the peculiar beard. He smiled gently. "Oh, sir, I'm not so sure about eternity, but I was thinking about time. It seems to pass faster when we're happy and slower when we're sad. But is there an objective flow of time? A universal clock that we all must obey?" A smirk formed on Marx's lips, a smile both wise and a little ironic. Time, a fascinating category. But the clock you're searching for is not among the stars, my boy. It's right here, beneath our feet. It's measured not by the ticking of a pendulum, but by the motion of the modes of production. The time of slavery was measured by the crack of the whip on a slave's back. The time of feudalism was measured by the turning of the windmill and the cycle of the harvest. And our time, this capitalist era, he gestured toward the bustling street, is measured by the speed of the assembly line and the frantic circulation of capital. Each historical epoch has its own rhythm of time. That is the most objective flow there is. Einstein listened, his eyes lighting up. He had never thought of time in that way. "You mean to say that time is a social product? A human-made construct?" "Not entirely," Marx replied, his finger tapping a steady beat on the table. "Time, like space, is a form of the existence of matter. That is fundamental. But how we perceive and live within that time is determined by the material conditions of society. A peasant lives by the cycles of the sun and moon. A factory worker lives by the shift whistle. A capitalist lives by the pulse of the stock market. They all exist in the same universe, but in different temporal frames of reference. Matter determines consciousness, young man. And the economic infrastructure is the foundational matter that determines the entire superstructure of society, including how we conceive of abstract concepts like time. Einstein nodded, captivated by the stranger's rigorous logic. A frame of reference. How interesting. In my physics, the frame of reference is key to understanding motion. The motion of an object is only meaningful relative to another object. There is no absolute motion. Perhaps you were speaking of a theory of relativity for history. You could call it that. Marx smiled, pleased that the young man had grasped his point. But my theory of relativity doesn't just stop at observation. It demands change. History is not a peacefully flowing river, but a series of contradictions and struggles. Each mode of production, upon reaching its zenith, creates within itself irreconcilable internal contradictions. The contradiction between the increasingly socialized forces of production and the relations of production based on private appropriation. This contradiction, my boy, is the engine of history. It cannot be resolved with elegant equations on paper. It must be resolved through action, through class struggle, through revolution. He paused, taking a sip of his stone-cold coffee. You look at the heavens and see the harmony of universal laws. I look at the earth and see the chaos of human society. You seek a single equation to describe everything. A theory of everything? So do I. But my theory is not a mathematical formula. It is dialectical materialism. It states that matter is in constant motion, and that motion occurs through the unity and struggle of opposites. Life and death, accumulation and pauperization, the exploiting class and the exploited class. These are the pairs of categories that compose the melody of history. Einstein fell silent, thinking. His worldview was built on a belief in a rational order, a mathematical beauty hidden behind all natural phenomena. Newton's universe was a perfect clockwork machine, and although he was trying to modify it, he still believed in some deep, underlying harmony. The idea of a world driven by ceaseless contradiction and struggle made him uneasy. But sir, he ventured cautiously, if everything is struggle, everything is contradiction, then where's the place for objective truth? For immutable laws? The speed of light in a vacuum is the same for all observers, whether they are a worker or a factory owner. Newton's law of gravitation does not distinguish between rich and poor. Are there not fundamental truths, laws of nature, that exist outside and above the struggles of human society? Man can change society, but can man change the law? E equals mc? Einstein's question hung in the air, sharp and direct. It was the collision of two worldviews, two approaches to reality. On one side, the world of social laws, mutable and full of conflict. On the other, the world of natural laws, eternal and harmonious. Marx looked deep into Einstein's eyes, and for a moment, he saw an image of his younger self. A young man also filled with the ambition to discover the universal laws of the world. But their paths had diverged. The dialogue had only just begun. The chessboard between history and the cosmos had just been set, and in the small cafe in Bern, time seemed to stand still, awaiting the next move from two of the greatest minds. The young man's question, sharp as a scalpel, cut through Marx's train of thought. It struck at the very heart of the difference between the two men, the two worldviews. Marx did not answer immediately. He gently stroked his silver beard, his gaze drifting out the window, where a worker was hunched over pushing a heavily laden cart. That image, for him, contained more truth than any equation. A very good, very fundamental question, Marx finally said, his voice not wavering but instead lit with a spark of interest. You have drawn the line between the kingdom of nature and the kingdom of history. You are correct. Man cannot change the law, E equals mc, just as we cannot command the earth to stop spinning or alter the law of universal gravitation. Those laws are what I call objective material conditions. We are born into a world not of our own choosing, a world with pre-existing laws, Imagine it as a giant iron cage in which all of us, from the beggar to the king, are imprisoned. The laws of physics, chemistry, biology, these are the bars of that cage. We cannot break them. Einstein nodded slightly, feeling his position acknowledged. But he knew that with a man like Marx, this was only the beginning. However, Marx continued, raising a finger for emphasis. Recognizing that we are in an iron cage is only the first step of consciousness. The more important question is, what do we do inside that cage? Do we have a key to open it? And my answer is yes. That key is not found in some distant place. It lies in these very hands. He held out his own hand, calloused from holding a pen and turning pages. But he envisioned it as the hand of the worker outside. That key is called labor. Labor. Einstein repeated, a hint of skepticism in his voice. Can labor change a physical law? Not change it, but transform it, Marx corrected. Hey, listen. Your law, E equals MC, has existed since the universe began, has it not? It lies hidden in every atom, in every ray of light. But for millions of years, it was merely a thing in itself, a silent truth, meaningless to humanity. It warmed no one, illuminated no one, worked for no one. When did it become a thing for us, a real power? When human consciousness, through scientific practice, which is itself a special form of intellectual labor, recognized it. And more importantly, when humanity, through productive labor, found a way to apply it. He paused, letting his idea sink into the young man's mind. Think about it. How is it that you, Albert Einstein, a scientist, can exist and think about the universe? You can sit here because a farmer grew the wheat, a miller ground the flour, and a baker baked the bread you ate. You can conduct your research because society has developed to a level where it can spare some people from direct manual labor, allowing them to pursue intellectual labor. Your intellect, however extraordinary, is a product of history, a product of the social division of labor. You stand on the shoulders of millions of nameless laborers who created the material surplus for society. Marx's words were like a splash of cold water on the romantic ego of the scientist, who had always believed in the power of pure thought, of the brilliant individual. Einstein had always felt himself to be a solitary observer, trying to listen to the symphony of the cosmos. He had never truly considered that the symphony he heard was being played on a stage built by society. And when you discover that formula, Marx continued in an almost hypnotic tone, the formula itself is still just symbols on paper. What does it become next? Does it become a nuclear power plant, providing endless energy? Liberating humanity from drudgery, shortening the workday, creating a society of abundance and freedom? Or does it become an atomic bomb, a tool of destruction, in the hands of the ruling class to maintain their power and wage imperialist wars? Do you see? The iron cage of natural law is immutable, but whether we use the key of labor to turn its bars into a palace or a prison depends entirely on the relations of production and society. Under capitalism, where profit is supreme, every great scientific discovery risks becoming a tool for deeper exploitation and more horrific destruction. Under communism, where labor is liberated, science will truly serve humanity. Einstein was stunned. For the first time, he felt a terrible weight of responsibility on his shoulders, a weight he had never been conscious of before. He only wanted to discover the truth, the beauty of the universe. He never wanted to create a monster. He looked at his equations and saw their purity, their elegance. But through this man's words, they were suddenly stained with the blood, sweat, and tears of humankind.
So you mean to say?
Einstein said slowly, trying to order the chaotic thoughts in his head that scientific truth is not pure, that it is always tainted by society. Asterisk, I don't say tainted. I say it is shaped and given meaning by society, Marx replied. The objective truth of nature still exists. The earth still revolves around the sun, no matter what the Inquisition says. But how that truth is discovered, how it is interpreted, and for what purpose it is used, that is a story of history, of class struggle. Galileo had to confront the power of the feudal church. Scientists today must confront the power of capital, of corporations, of bourgeois states. Science is never outside of politics, young man. To believe that it can be is the most naive political stance of all. Marx looked at the young man with an expression that was both stern and sympathetic. You are trying to read the mind of God, as Spinoza, a philosopher we both admire, might have said. You believe in a rational order, a cosmic harmony. I understand that. But I want to tell you this. There is another universe. It's no less complex and magnificent, and that is the universe of human society. It, too, has its own laws of motion, laws concerning the development of the forces of production, of class struggle, of the succession of socioeconomic formations. And unlike your laws, these laws are not merely to be observed. They demand that we act. Because we are not just mindless dust particles swept along in the cosmic current. We are the subjects who create history. In the small cafe in Bern, two conceptions of law had faced off. One was the law of nature, eternal, written in the language of mathematics, demanding contemplation and discovery. The other was the law of history, mutable, written in the sweat and blood of generations, demanding intervention and revolution. Einstein felt the foundations of his worldview shaking. He, a pacifist, a believer in internationalism and human equality, suddenly realized that those ideals could not exist solely in equations or in the hearts of single individuals. They had to be materialized, to be rooted in the very economic structure of society. He looked outside. The worker was gone, but the image of his stooped back was still seared into Einstein's mind. It was no longer just an image. It was a variable in a colossal social equation. He had never tried to solve. The silence that settled over the small table was heavy. Einstein stirred his cold tea, the clinking of the metal spoon against the ceramic cup, a lonely, sharp sound. He was trying to digest what the old man had just said. The idea of a science that was not pure, of a truth bound by social conditions, disturbed him. It was like being told that a Mozart symphony was really just a series of air vibrations arranged to sell tickets. Physically true, perhaps, but it stripped the music of its soul. God. Sir Einstein finally spoke, his voice carrying a gentle resistance. I understand what you're saying about the application of science, but isn't the very act of discovery, the moment of epiphany, the pure joy of understanding a law of the universe, isn't that in itself a form of liberation? When I struggle with an equation, the outside world seems to disappear. There are no masters, no workers, no money, or politics. There is only me and the universe in a silent dialogue. That is a kind of freedom that no social system can touch. It is not labor in the sense you describe. It is play. A play of the spirit. He spoke with a sincere passion, his dreamy eyes lit with the fire of a deep conviction. He believed in the autonomy of the world of ideas, in a haven of pure thought, where one could temporarily escape the fetters of the mortal world. Marx listened intently, without interrupting. When Einstein finished, a smile flickered across his face, a smile not of mockery, but of understanding. The play of the spirit, he repeated, his tone musing. A beautiful phrase. And you are right, young man. In its essence, labor is play. It is a free, creative activity where man affirms himself, transforming the ideas in his head into material reality. A carpenter rejoices when he sees the table he built take shape. A farmer feels fulfilled looking at a field of golden wheat. And a scientist like you feels a transcendent joy when a piece of the cosmic mystery is unveiled. That is what I call the human essence, Gedankenwesen, the capacity for free, conscious labor. That is the paradise you speak of. He paused, and then his voice grew stern, a bass note in the melody. But we are not living in that paradise. We are living under capitalism. And under capitalism, labor, instead of being a play of self-affirmation, becomes a means of self-destruction. It becomes something alien, opposed to the laborer himself. It is alienation. Alienation. Einstein frowned. That is a rather heavy philosophical term. It is heavy because it describes a heavy reality, Marx replied. Let us consider your play. You say that when you think, the world disappears. But after you think, after you discover an idea, an invention, what happens to it? Does it still belong to you? Or is it written down on a patent application, your daily work here and burn? And once patented, what does it become? It becomes private property. It is torn from its creator, becoming a commodity on the market. People will buy and sell it, speculate on it. It is no longer a part of your spirit, but has become an external force, an alien thing that dominates you in turn. That is the first and most fundamental form, alienation from the product of labor. Your product, be it a mathematical formula or a machine, will be used by the bourgeois class. For what? To serve humanity? No, to generate profit. To increase productivity, which means to exploit workers more efficiently. Or to create new weapons, which means to kill people more efficiently. Your idea, your spiritual child, will turn against the very laborers who fed you. Do you see the tragedy? Einstein was silent. His work at the patent office suddenly appeared in a different light. Every day he read the ideas of others, sparks of ingenuity, and his job was to stamp them, to turn them into exclusive property. He had never thought of it as a process of expropriation. And it goes further, Marx continued, not giving the young man time to recover. Consider the very act of your labor. You call it free play. But is it really? Today, science requires enormous resources. Laboratories, equipment. Who provides them? Universities funded by capitalists, industrial corporations, bourgeois states, and they provide funding not out of a love for truth. They fund research that is likely to be profitable, research that serves their interests. The free curiosity of the scientist is directed, confined within frameworks set by capital. The scientist is no longer free to pursue whatever he wishes. He must write proposals, apply for grants, prove the applicability, that is, the money-making potential of his ideas. Your play has been turned into wage labor. You no longer labor for the joy of it, but for external ends. That is alienation from the act of labor itself. When labor is no longer the expression of man's creative nature, Marx's voice became almost tragic. Then man is also alienated from his own essence. He is separated from what makes him human. Instead of a creative subject, he becomes a cog in a machine. That is, alienation from the human essence. Finally, when man is alienated from his product, from his activity, and from his essence, he is inevitably alienated from other men. Under capitalism, the relationship between people is no longer one of mutual support and cooperation, but of competition. Workers compete with each other for a job. Capitalists compete with each other for market share. And scientists, my dear young man, are no exception. They compete for funding, for priority in publication, for prizes, for a place in the history books. Cooperation gives way to jealousy. Knowledge, which should be the common property of humanity, is fractured into jealously guarded intellectual property. The scientific community is torn apart into isolated, suspicious individuals. Marx concluded his long analysis. The air in the cafe seemed to thicken. The abstract concepts he had spoken of alienation suddenly became frighteningly concrete in Einstein's mind. He thought of his colleagues, of the bitter disputes over priority of discovery, of the pressure to publish or perish. He thought about the future of the theories he was nurturing. Would they truly bring light to humanity, or just be another tool in the hands of the powerful? The paradise of pure thought he had always believed in suddenly showed cracks. He realized that the ivory tower he thought he inhabited was, in fact, also a prisoner, more elegantly painted prison. Perhaps, but still governed by the same pendulum, the pendulum of capital. He was not a free observer of the universe. He was a laborer too, and like all other laborers, was being alienated. The weight Marx had left in the air did not dissipate easily. Einstein felt as if the walls of the cafe were closing in, and the vast universe he often roamed in his mind had suddenly become cramped. The stranger's theory of alienation had a terrifying power, for it was not just an external critique. It seemed to describe an internal sickness, a sickness of which he himself was a symptom. But the instincts of a scientist would not allow him to accept a theory without probing it, searching for its weaknesses, its exceptions. He could not believe that the entire spiritual life of humanity was determined solely by economics. Perhaps you were right, Einstein began, his voice low and hesitant. He took off his round glasses and wiped them on his coat, a gesture of deep confusion. Perhaps my work, and the work of many others, has been distorted by this machine you call capitalism. I feel the weight of your words, but I still believe there is something deeper, something that cannot be alienated, cannot be bought and sold. It is curiosity, the desire to understand, put his glasses back on, and looked directly at Marx, his eyes searching for empathy, for acknowledgement. The impulse that made me wonder why a compass needle always points north when I was a child. The drive that kept me awake at night trying to imagine riding on a beam of light. Where did it come from? It did not come from the bourgeoisie or the proletariat. It did not come from the relations of production. I believe it comes from a more primordial place. It is part of what we call human nature. Just as a bird has an instinct to fly, man has an instinct to ask questions. That instinct, sir, is the true engine of all scientific progress and perhaps of all history. The social system may be the cage, as you say, but it cannot kill the bird inside. Einstein had made his strongest rebuttal. He had shifted the debate from the sociological to a realm where he felt more secure, that which is universal, eternal. He was betting on a human constant, an Archimedean point outside the fluctuating stream of history. Marx listened, nodding slowly. He seemed unsurprised by this argument. As a professor of philosophy myself, I know this is one of the oldest debates in thought. Does man have a fixed a priori nature, or is that nature shaped by circumstance? Human nature, Marx repeated, and this time there was no irony in his voice, only a profound seriousness. You have touched upon the most fundamental question, young man. And yes, there is a bird inside. But my question is, what song does that bird learn to sing? And who taught it that song? He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. You believe curiosity is unchanging. I do not deny its existence. But I say that the very form in which curiosity manifests itself, the object it directs itself toward, and the purpose it serves are entirely historical. It is not a constant, but a mirror that reflects the very society that produced it. Consider this, he continued. Where was the curiosity of a prehistoric hunter-gatherer directed? Toward discovering which fruits were edible, which animals could be hunted, which weather signs foretold a storm. His curiosity was tied to immediate survival. And the curiosity of a medieval theologian? It was directed toward interpreting the Bible, seeking God's will in every object, constructing complex metaphysical systems to prove the existence of the divine. His curiosity was shaped by faith in the power structure of the church. In your curiosity, Albert Einstein, a scientist of the 20th century, where is it directed? Toward finding universal mathematical laws, elegant equations that can describe the motion of the cosmos? Why mathematics? Why abstract laws? Have you ever asked yourself that? Marx didn't wait for an answer, because you live in the age of the bourgeoisie, an age that is itself built on abstraction. What is the logic of capitalism? It is to turn everything into a commodity. A coat, a loaf of bread, an hour of a worker's labor. Even a scientific ideal are stripped of their concrete, sensory qualities and are reduced to a single abstraction, exchange value, measured in money. The entire society operates according to a universal, cold, calculable logic. Your curiosity, unconsciously, has been molded by that very logic. You seek a universal equation for the cosmos, just as the capitalist seeks a universal formula for generating profit. Your curiosity, my great scientist, is a very bourgeois curiosity. Marx's final statement was like a thunderclap, a bourgeois curiosity. The thought was both insulting and strangely enlightening to Einstein. He had always considered his intellectual journey a rebellion against all conventions, all prejudices. But now, he was being told he was a typical product of the very society from which he often felt estranged. So you mean to say, Einstein stammered, that there is no such thing as human nature? That we are merely blank slates of clay that society molds into whatever shape it wishes? No, it is not so simple. Marx shook his head. Man is not passive clay. Man has certain biological potentials, a large brain, dexterous hands, the capacity for language. But what those potentials develop into, how they are used, is the story of history. I once wrote, "The human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, it is the ensemble of the social relations. Who you are, what you think, what you desire, are shaped by where you were born, at what time, in which class, and in relation to other people. There is no generic, abstract man who exists outside of history. There is only the man of the primitive commune, the man of slave society, the man of feudalism, and the man of capitalism. Each of these has a different nature because they live in different ensembles of social relations. The bird in your cage, it doesn't just sing a song taught by society. The cage itself, over many generations, has changed the very structure of the bird's vocal cords, determining which notes it is capable of singing. The dialogue had reached a deeper level, from the problem of science to the problem of labor, now to the very being of man. Einstein felt as if the ground beneath him was no longer a solid foundation of immutable laws, but a roaring river of history. He, who had proven that space and time were relative, was now faced with an even more staggering idea that human nature itself was relative. Relative to history, the sun had dipped westward, casting long, slanted rays through the cafe window, illuminating the tiny dust motes dancing in the air. To Einstein, those motes no longer seemed to follow a random Brownian motion. They appeared to be drawn into an invisible, directed current whose course he could not grasp. The idea of a human nature that changed with history had shattered one of the last pillars of his worldview. If there was no fixed point of reference, no universal essence, then how could we speak of truth, of morality, of justice? If what you say is true, Einstein spoke, his voice almost a whisper. If each era molds a different man, then doesn't everything become relative? The kindness of today could be the weakness of tomorrow. The truth I pursue may be merely the prejudice of my time. Compassion, love, the desire for freedom, are they all just phantoms created by a particular ensemble of social relations? If so, what is the meaning of the struggle for a better world? Is it not just the replacement of one illusion with another? This was the voice of a scientist facing the abyss of nihilism. If there are no universal laws, then all observations are merely local. If there is no universal human nature, then all moral values are merely conventional. Einstein felt a wave of dizziness, like a sailor who suddenly realizes the lighthouse he believed to be fixed is just another ship adrift on the sea. Marx showed no signs of triumph at the young man's confusion. On the contrary, he looked at Einstein with deep empathy. He understood that the path from metaphysical idealism to dialectical materialism must always pass through the desert of doubt. You are looking into the abyss and thinking it is empty, Marx said calmly. But you are mistaken. It is not empty. It is full of potential. You think that without a permanent human nature given by God or nature, we lose the foundation for morality and freedom. I say the opposite. It is precisely the idea of a fixed human nature that is the real chain. Because if man is predestined to be selfish, greedy, or warlike, then all efforts to change society are futile. Freedom, young man, is not a given state. It is a conquered process. It is not the escape from all laws, but the recognition of law in order to master it. One cannot fly freely by ignoring the law of gravity. One can only fly by understanding the principles of aerodynamics and building an airplane. Similarly, humanity cannot achieve social freedom by dreaming of abstract moral values. We can only be free when we recognize the laws of motion of history and act consciously to change it. He took a deep breath, as if preparing for his most important definition. The history of all hitherto existing society is, fundamentally, the story of man's struggle with necessity. First, the necessity of nature. Man must labor to fight against hunger, cold, wild beasts. In this stage, man is almost completely dominated by nature. This is the realm of necessity in its most primitive form. But through labor, man gradually transforms nature and also transforms himself. The forces of production develop. Man creates tools, society forms, and then classes emerge. From then on, alongside the necessity of nature, man faces a second necessity, one of his own making, the necessity of blind socioeconomic laws. The slave is chained by the will of the master. The serf is bound to the land of the Lord. And the modern worker, he glanced out at the street, is dominated by the invisible laws of the market, of the movement of capital, a force that no single individual, not even the capitalist, can control. He is legally free, but he is a slave to economic necessity. This is still the realm of necessity, only in a more sophisticated form. Einstein listened, drawn into the panoramic picture Marx was painting. It had a powerful internal logic, a stunning consistency. So where's the way out? He asked. Where's the realm of freedom you speak of? The realm of freedom, Marx replied, and his eyes shone with an iron conviction, can only begin where labor determined by necessity and external purpose ceases. It lies beyond the sphere of actual material production. Just as the savage must wrestle with nature to satisfy his wants, to maintain and reproduce life, so must civilized man. And he must do so in all social formations and under all possible modes of production. But, and this was the crucial point for the first time in history, capitalism, while pushing alienation to its peak, has simultaneously created the material conditions to transcend the realm of necessity. It has developed science and technology to a point where labor productivity has increased exponentially. In theory, we can already produce enough wealth for everyone, reduce necessary labor time to a minimum, and free up time for every individual to develop their full potential, to pursue science, art, philosophy, to play in the very sense you meant. The material possibility of entering the realm of freedom is already here. Then why haven't we entered it? Einstein asked impatiently. Because of the iron cage of capitalist relations of production? Marx tapped the table lightly. Its logic is not to satisfy human needs, but to generate profit. It creates immense wealth at one pole and extreme poverty at the other. It creates a surplus of goods, while millions cannot afford them. It has the potential to free man from drudgery, but it forces him to work longer hours under worse conditions to compete with machines. It has created the key, but it refuses to put it in the lock. The contradiction is ripe. The forces of production are roaring to break out of the shell of the relations of production that has become their fetter. That is the meaning of the proletarian revolution I speak of. Revolution, he concluded, is not the replacement of one illusion with another. It is the conscious act of humanity to seize control of its own destiny. It is the leap of man from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. Then, and only then, does the real history of man begin. Everything before it is merely prehistory. The picture was complete. Einstein no longer saw the abyss of nihilism. Instead, he saw a path, an arduous, thorny path, but a path leading upward. Freedom was not a gift, but a project. Morality was not a set of eternal rules, but the ceaseless struggle to create the conditions for a more humane society. In science, his life's work was not an innocent game, the most powerful tool in that struggler tool that could either chain humanity or set it free. The cafe was emptying out. Only the two of them remained, sitting in a silence that contained more thought than a noisy debate. Einstein felt as if he had just completed a long journey, not through the space-time of the cosmos, but through the geological strata of human history. The picture Marx had painted was both magnificent and terrifying. It had an irresistible appeal because it brought order, a logic, to the chaos of events. But it was also terrifying because that logic seemed to lead to an inescapable conclusion, revolution. And for Einstein, a pacifist to his core, the word revolution always conjured images of blood, violence, and the collapse of order. A leap, Einstein repeated Marx's words, his voice full of thought. From the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. It is a beautiful vision, but leaps in history are not often ballets, sir. They are usually earthquakes. You speak of breaking the iron cage of the relations of production. But how is it to be broken? By reason? By persuasion? History shows me that ruling classes never voluntarily relinquish their power. He paused, choosing his words carefully. And what happens after? After the old cage is broken, a new society will be built. But who will build it? And with what tools? I have heard of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. To me, a man who believes all forms of dictatorship are a crime. Those two words sound abhorrent together. How can we be sure that the revolution, in the name of freedom, will not give birth to a new monstrous dictatorship, a new machine of oppression, just under a different name? Einstein's question was no longer the skepticism of a scientist. It was the anxiety of a humanist. He could see the logic of alienation, the logic of class struggle, and even the logic of the necessity for fundamental change. But he recoiled from the means of that change. Marx looked at the young man. For the first time that afternoon, a shadow of sadness crossed his face. "You are touching upon the greatest pain of history," he said softly, "that it does not advance along a path strewn with roses. I am a humanist too, young man. I despise violence, but I do not confuse the violence of the oppressed, rising up to break their chains with the violence of the oppressor used to maintain those chains. I once called violence the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. The midwife may cause the mother pain, but without her, the child cannot be born. But before we speak of the dictatorship you fear, let us speak of another machine, one you live inside every day without perhaps realizing it. That is the state. The state." Einstein was surprised. This Swiss state? It seems quite peaceful. It ensures law and order, provides public services. Precisely, Marx cut in. It appears peaceful. It appears neutral. It appears to stand above all classes to serve the common good. That is the most sophisticated illusion the bourgeoisie has created. But scratch away that democratic paint, and what do you find underneath? The state, in its essence, is nothing more than an organized machine of violence for the suppression of one class by another. In feudal society, it was the machine of the nobility to suppress the serfs. In capitalist society, it is the machine of the bourgeoisie to suppress the proletariat. What does this machine consist of? The army, the police, the prisons, the courts. These are the tangible instruments of violence. But it also consists of more subtle instruments: the law, the education system, the church, the press. They create an ideology, a ruling ideology, which makes the domination of the bourgeoisie seem natural and rational. It teaches the worker to respect private property, that is, to respect the right to be exploited himself. It teaches the scientist like you that knowledge is to be patented and sold for profit. It is an invisible machine, imprisoning the human spirit more securely than any physical prison. Einstein was stunned. He had always thought of the state as a necessary entity for the existence of civilized society. He might criticize this policy or that, but he had never questioned its very nature. "So the dictatorship of the proletariat you speak of," Marx continued, "is not my evil invention. It is simply the proletariat, after seizing power, using that state machine to do the opposite. Instead of being the state of a small minority, the bourgeoisie, to suppress the majority of the proletariat, it will be the state of the majority to suppress the minority of former exploiters, to prevent them from staging a comeback. It is not a dictatorship in the sense of one individual or one party ruling with an iron fist. It is the exercise of power by the entire working class, and its purpose is not to perpetuate class rule forever. On the contrary, its ultimate purpose is to abolish all classes. When there are no more exploiting classes, when their resistance is broken, when society has been reorganized on the basis of common ownership of the means of production, then the state as an instrument of suppression will no longer be necessary. It will not be abolished. It will wither away. The purely administrative functions of society will remain, but the political function of domination will disappear. Marx's explanation had a cold, ruthless logic. He did not romanticize or sugarcoat the revolution. He described it as a scientific process, an inevitable transition with its own laws and stages. The state was not a moral ideal, but a tool. And like any tool, it had to be used to serve the purpose of the one who wielded it. "Think of your own work," Marx said, bringing the discussion back to Einstein's world. Who funds the most expensive physics research? The bourgeois states. Why? For its promise of military applications. Your theory of relativity, one day, may be used to create weapons you cannot even imagine. The bourgeois state will not hesitate to use the greatest invention of the human spirit for the most brutal purpose of destruction. A proletarian state, in contrast, would focus all the scientific resources of society on improving life, conquering disease, exploring the universe for the common good of humanity. The confrontation was no longer between a materialist and an idealist. It was a confrontation within Einstein himself, between the peace-loving humanist and the logical thinker who was beginning to recognize the naked truth of power. He abhorred violence, but he could not deny the logic that one cannot build a new house on a rotten, old foundation without using a hammer and a crowbar. He longed for a free, equal society, but he was beginning to understand that such freedom could not be achieved as long as the invisible machine of the bourgeois state was still running, day and night, crushing the best potentials of humanity. He looked out the window. Dusk had fallen on Bern. The street lamps were beginning to be lit, creating a false sense of peace. But now, Einstein knew that beneath that peace, an invisible war was raging. And he, whether he liked it or not, was a soldier in that war. The yellow light in the cafe cast long, strange shadows. For Einstein, the world seemed to have split in two. One was the world of objects obeying elegant equations, a universe that was predictable and understandable. The other was the world described by the man opposite him, a world kneaded by violence, power, and relentless struggle. He tried to find a bridge between these two worlds, but the more he tried, the deeper the chasm between them seemed to grow. I will concede the logic in your analysis of the state, Einstein said slowly, each word seeming to carry an invisible weight. Perhaps it is indeed a machine of repression, an instrument of the ruling class. But that very fact frightens me more. If the proletariat gains control of that machine, even with the best intentions, will they not themselves be transformed by it? A man who holds a hammer for too long, sir, begins to see everything as a nail. A class that becomes accustomed to using state power to suppress, can it easily relinquish that power? He looked directly at Marx, and in his eyes was no longer intellectual skepticism, but the anguish of conscience. You say the state will wither away. It's a beautiful idea. But in my physics, every process requires a mechanism, a driving force. What will drive this withering process? Who will guard the guardians? History is filled with examples of revolutions that devoured their own children, of liberators who became new tyrants. Might your dictatorship of the proletariat be merely a way station on the road to another form of despotism? Perhaps even more total because it is carried out in the name of all humanity? It was the most profound accusation. Einstein was suggesting that Marx's theory had a fatal flaw. It underestimated the seductive power of power and the dark side of human nature, the very human nature Marx claimed was a product of history. Marx did not flinch. He seemed to have been waiting for this question, to have asked it of himself 1,000 times during his long, lonely nights in London. You have identified the central contradiction of all revolutions, he replied, his voice calm but firm. How to use power? To abolish power. How to walk through the mire without getting dirty? There is no simple answer, no equation that can guarantee success. But the answer lies not in empty moral appeals, but in the analysis of material conditions. You must understand that the proletarian revolution cannot be fully successful if it occurs in only a single country. Capitalism is a global system. If one country undergoes a socialist revolution, it will immediately be besieged by hostile capitalist powers. They will try to strangle it from the outside through military intervention and economic embargoes. And they will try to sabotage it from within by supporting the remnants of the old exploiting classes. Under such circumstances, the young proletarian state is forced to maintain a strong defense apparatus, a strong security machine. It is forced to be dictatorial in self-defense. That state cannot wither away as long as it is under threat. Therefore, he stressed, the withering away of the state depends not on the goodwill of the leaders, but on the victory of the world revolution. Only when capitalism is overthrown on a global scale or at least in its key centers, will the external threat disappear. Only then can humanity begin the process of true disarmament, not just of weapons, but of the state machine itself. Einstein pondered this. The logic of an international revolution was something he could understand. Science, after all, knew no borders. But this seemed only to postpone the problem, not solve it. But even if the world revolution succeeds, he countered, the internal problem remains. The problem of the very people who run the new society. Precisely. Marx nodded. And that is where the second material condition comes into play. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not an end in itself, but merely a transitional phase. What is its goal? To build the material foundation for a new society, communist society. What is that foundation? The immense development of the forces of production to the point where scarcity is eliminated. Think about this, young man. What is the ultimate source of all inequality? All power struggles? All crime? It is scarcity. When there is not enough material wealth for everyone, conflict inevitably arises. One group will seek to appropriate it and dominate the others. The state is the instrument for protecting that appropriation. But in a society where machinery and technology have freed man from arduous labor, where wealth flows like a spring, where each can contribute according to his ability and receive according to his needs, the material basis for the struggle for power disappears. Why would one need to accumulate wealth when one can have everything one needs? Why would one need to rule over others when there are no economic interests to protect? Then the administration of society will no longer be the government of persons, but simply the administration of things. It will become a technical, administrative task carried out in rotation by those with expertise. Just as you might solve a physics problem, it will no longer have a political character. The process of the state withering away, therefore, is a process that runs parallel to the abolition of classes and the overcoming of scarcity. It is an equation with many variables, but they are all interconnected. It is not a miracle, but the necessary result of a profound socioeconomic transformation. It is a long process, perhaps taking many generations. A process in which man not only changes the world but also changes himself, cleansing himself of the muck of ages. Marx had given his answer. It was not a promise, but a prediction based on scientific analysis. He did not deny the dangers, but he placed them within a larger law of motion. Violence and dictatorship were not the goals, but painful variables in a complex equation, the equation of the transformation from class society to classless society, from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. For Einstein, it was still a terrifying gamble, but for the first time, he saw the logic behind it. It was not blind fanaticism, but a faith built on a colossal theoretical system. He, who was accustomed to thinking about processes that spanned billions of cosmic years, should perhaps learn to be more patient with the painful, transformative process of human history. The twilight had completely faded, giving way to the thick Bernese night. Through the glass pane, Einstein could see the stars beginning to twinkle. They were still there, eternal, distant, obeying the unchanging laws he had dedicated his life to understanding. But now, looking at them, he saw not just the equations of gravity or optics, he saw a profound contrast, the silent harmony of the cosmos and the stormy motion of the human world right beneath his feet. "You have given me a new universe," Einstein said, his voice no longer resistant, but deeply contemplative. A universe of human society, which also has its own laws, its own forces of attraction and repulsion. I am beginning to understand its logic, a ruthless but consistent logic. It's like thermodynamics. One cannot predict the motion of a single gas molecule, but one can calculate with precision the pressure, temperature, and volume of the entire gas. Perhaps individual human beings are like those molecules acting chaotically, but the behavior of an entire class, an entire society, follows predictable statistical laws. He had found an analogy in his own world, a way to bridge the two universes. It was the acknowledgement of one great intellect before another great system of thought. A very clever comparison, my boy. Marx smiled in approval. Yes, History has its objective laws, which operate independently of the will of single individuals. The forces of production develop, class contradictions intensify, revolutions erupt. These are the major trends, the powerful currents. He paused, and his gaze sharpened. But there is a fundamental difference between your gas molecules and my human beings. A gas molecule has no consciousness. It does not know it is part of a volume of gas. It cannot band together with other molecules to decide whether to heat or cool its container. But man has consciousness. Man can become aware of his position in history, aware of the laws that govern him. And through that awareness, man can act to accelerate or retard the flow of history. This brings me to a question that has been hovering in my mind throughout our conversation, Einstein said, leaning forward. In your grand model of productive forces and relations of production, of classes and revolutions, where is the place for the individual? Where is the place for a Newton, a Darwin, or, forgive me, an Einstein? Are we merely puppets, pulled by the invisible strings of economic laws? Does a great idea, a breakthrough invention, a courageous act by a single person, have no power to change the course of history? My theory of relativity, did it come from the motion of capital or from my curiosity? It was the question of free will, of the role of great individuals, an eternal question. Einstein, at the peak of his individual creative power, could not accept a theory that seemed to render him a passive product of his circumstances. Marx did not dismiss the question. He embraced it. Have you read Hegel, young man? Hegel said that freedom is the recognition of necessity. I agree, but I add an action based on that recognition. The role of the great individual is not to create history out of nothing. No one can do that. I once wrote, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. Imagine history as a great river, he continued, using a simple metaphor to explain a complex idea. The riverbed is determined by the geological structure of the modes of production. The direction of the river's flow is the necessary trend of history. Most people are just drops of water carried along by the current, but there are special individuals. They cannot make the river flow backward. To do so is the act of a utopian idealist, and he will be drowned by the current. A great man, Marx's voice became solemn, is a skilled helmsman. He does not create the river, but he understands its currents, its eddies, its hidden reefs. He knows when to raise the sail, to catch the wind of the age, when to turn the rudder to avoid an obstacle. He can see the path to a new sea that others cannot. He does not fight against necessity. He grasps necessity and turns it into an instrument of his will. Newton did not invent experimental science by himself. He appeared at a time when the rising bourgeoisie needed precise mechanics to develop industry and navigation. The needs of the age posed the problem, and Newton's genius provided the solution. Darwin did not invent the idea of evolution on his own. Many had thought of it before him, but he appeared at a time when evidence from geology and paleontology had sufficiently accumulated, and his theory provided a mechanism, natural selection, to explain it. A mechanism that fit very well with the competitive spirit of bourgeois society. He turned to look directly at Einstein. And you, my young friend, your genius is undeniable. But why did you appear at the beginning of the 20th century and not the 18th? Because it was precisely at this moment that the classical physical edifice of Newton was showing irreparable cracks. Experiments on light, on electromagnetism, had yielded results that contradicted the old laws. The history of physics had reached a turning point. It demanded a revolution. The problem was posed, and your mind found the solution. You are the helmsman who saw the way through the storm. Marx's analysis did not diminish Einstein's genius. On the contrary, it placed it in an even grander context. It turned Einstein from a solitary star into the apex of a pyramid, built upon the efforts of thousands who came before. So, the individual is not a puppet, Marx concluded. The individual is an agent of history, but his degree of freedom and influence depends on how well he recognizes and acts. in accordance with the objective laws of his time. In class society, even the greatest geniuses are limited, alienated, their ideas distorted to serve the interests of the ruling class. But imagine communist society, the true realm of freedom, when man has mastered social laws, when the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Then there will not be just a few great individuals, but the creative potential of all humanity will be unleashed. Every person will become a helmsman of his own life, and together they will steer the common ship of humanity toward new horizons. That will be the true beginning of individual history. In the dim yellow light, Einstein looked at his own hands, the hands that had written the equations that could change humanity's perception of the universe. But for the first time, he was aware that the ink in his pen was not his alone. It was mixed with the sweat, tears, and intellect of countless generations who had passed down the river of history. He was not the creator of the river, but perhaps he could be the one to help it flow faster toward the great ocean of freedom. The night outside the cafe seemed deeper now, making the small, warm space within an island of light and thought. The dialogue had stretched for hours, yet neither man seemed tired. They had traveled from the laws of the cosmos to the laws of history, from the alienation of labor to the role of the individual. Now, after a stormy journey through contradictions and conflicts, a strange sense of peace began to spread. It was Einstein who broke the silence. He no longer questioned with skepticism or resistance. His voice was meditative, as if thinking aloud, trying to fit the last pieces of a giant puzzle together. In my work, he said, the ultimate goal is always the search for simplicity, for harmony. I believe the most fundamental laws of the universe must be elegant, beautiful. A complex, messy equation is often a sign that we have not yet understood the truth. When you describe capitalism, I see a system that is incredibly complex and irrational. It creates wealth only to generate poverty. It develops technology only to enslave people. It is full of petty contradictions, horrific waste, chaotic motions. It is truly ugly from the perspective of a physicist. He looked up at Marx, and a light, genuine smile touched his lips. And when you speak of communist society, of the realm of freedom, I don't just hear an economic theory or a political program. I hear a yearning for harmony. A society where production is rationally planned to meet human needs, where there are no more crises, no more unemployment, where the development of the individual blends with the development of the community. Sir, is that not, in essence, also a search for beauty? A search for an elegant social equation? Marx burst out laughing, a hearty, uninhibited laugh that seemed to dispel the heavy atmosphere that had enveloped their conversation. You've said it. You've said it perfectly, young man, he exclaimed. You have seen into the heart of the matter. Communism, for me, is not just a historical necessity. It is an aesthetic demand. Capitalism is ugly because it is irrational. It is like a machine assembled from mismatched parts, constantly creating friction, screeching, and threatening to explode at any moment. It turns our cities into suffocating concrete jungles, our rivers into sewers, and turns labor, which should be an artistic activity, into monotonous torture. Communist society, his voice became passionate. Full of fervor, will be a great work of art created by all of humanity together. It is the harmony between man and nature, when we no longer blindly exploit nature, but consciously coexist with and care for it. It is the harmony between the individual and society, when the interests of each are no longer opposed to the interests of the collective. It is the harmony within man himself, when the division between mental and manual labor is abolished, or when the worker is also a poet and the scientist is also an artist. That is the symphony of freedom you speak of. The two men, the revolutionary and the scientist, found their deepest common ground, a belief in reason, in order, and in beauty. They simply approached it from two different directions. One sought it in the immutable laws of the universe. The other sought to construct it in the mutable world of human society. And science, Einstein continued, his eyes lighting up with a new vision, what would science be like in that world? I can imagine a science no longer in service of war, no longer dominated by profit. Scientists from all over the world would collaborate as brothers, solving humanity's greatest challenges together, curing diseases, providing clean energy, exploring the mysteries of the universe. Yes, Marx nodded. Science would return to its true nature, the great tool for human liberation. It would no longer be an alien force, a black box that the majority of people fear and do not understand. Scientific knowledge would be widely disseminated. Every worker would understand the principles of the machines they operate. Every farmer would apply the latest advances in biology. The opposition between the two cultures, science and the humanities, would disappear, because science would be seen as the most beautiful chapter in the epic poem of human ascent. Then Marx continued, his voice lowering to a solemn, almost prophetic tone. When humanity has resolved its internal contradictions, when it has arranged its common home rationally and harmoniously, what will it do next? It will not stop. Man's desire to know is infinite. After mastering its own planet, humanity will turn its collective gaze outward to the cosmos, not as competing nations, but as a unified human species. He looked out the window, at the stars shining in the deep black sky. You look up there and see physical laws. I look up there and see the new horizon of consciousness, the next stage for the drama of human history. Perhaps that is where our two universes, the universe of nature and the universe of society, will finally meet. When a fully liberated humanity begins its journey to explore and transform the cosmos, that is when man will truly become a cosmic force in the proper sense. In that moment, the final wall between the two men seemed to crumble. Karl Marx, the historical materialist, and Albert Einstein, the theoretical physicist, had come to share a dream. A dream not of a paradise in the afterlife, but of a paradise that could be built right here on Earth, and from there reach for the stars. The dream of a humanity that had come of age, that had overcome its violent, selfish childhood, to begin a grand adventure of consciousness and creation. Outside, a church clock in Bern began to chime. But this time, for Einstein, the chime was no longer the measure of an absolute, objective time. It was the beat of a historical moment, a moment of synthesis, of reconciliation, of hope. Time, whether historical or relative, must ultimately bow to worldly rhythms. The cafe door creaked open, and the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired but kind eyes, approached their table. "Gentlemen," she said in a soft Swiss-German accent, "we are closing now." That simple act, that ordinary phrase, shattered the special space-time the two great minds had created. The dream was over. Marx and Einstein both turned to look at the waitress, as if waking from a trance. The cafe suddenly became ordinary again, smelling of stale coffee and echoing with the clinking of glasses being cleared away. Einstein was the first to regain his composure. He looked at the man with the bushy beard opposite him, and for a moment, he was no longer an abstract thinker but a teacher, a companion on a brief but intense intellectual adventure. "I must thank you," Einstein said, and his voice held a deep sincerity. "This afternoon, it has shaken my world. You did not give me final answers, but you gave me better, bigger questions. You have pulled my telescope down from the stars to the earth. And now, when I look back at the stars, I see them not just as physical entities. I see them as the legacy of the universe and the destination of humanity." He paused and smiled. "I will still search for my equation, one that can describe everything. But perhaps I now understand that such an equation, if it exists, will be meaningless without another one to accompany it. The equation for a humane society, where people are free to contemplate and understand it." Marx gave a solemn nod. He had accomplished his mission. He had not sought to convert the young man, but only to plant in his mind a seed of dialectical thinking, an awareness of the connection between the world of ideas and the world of matter. "Dear friend, is all theory, and green the golden tree of life," Marx said, his voice deep and warm, quoting a line from Goethe they both loved. "Keep questioning. Keep searching. Your universe and my history are not two separate worlds. They are one." Man is a part of nature, but the only part of nature capable of self-consciousness and self-creation. History is not a predetermined fate. It is a possibility waiting to be realized, and it is waiting for an answer from your generation. He stood up, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the lamplight. It is time for me to go. Where will you go? Einstein asked, the question somewhat naive. Marx smiled, a smile both mysterious and kind. Back to the books. Back to the struggle. I belong to the 19th century, but our dialogue belongs to the future. He turned and walked out of the cafe. He did not go left or right down the street. He simply merged into the darkness, vanishing like a ghost, a memory. Leaving Einstein alone with his thoughts and the bill for 2 coffees and a tea. Young Albert Einstein sat alone in the empty cafe. He looked out the window up at the night sky over Bern. The stars were still there, cold and distant. But to him now, they were no longer silent. They were telling a story of matter in motion, of energy and transformation, and of a small species on a blue planet, which, after millions of years of struggle with nature and with itself, was finally looking up, ready for a dialogue with the cosmos. He knew the road would be long, but for the first time, he did not feel alone on the journey. Of course, that meeting never happened. It is merely a fantasy, a game played by an old philosophy professor. Karl Marx died when Albert Einstein was just a 4-year-old boy. They never sat together in a cafe in Bern. But their dialogue, the dialogue between the worldviews they represent, is very real. It has been taking place ceaselessly for over a century. In university lecture halls, in factories, on battlefields, and in the minds of every thinking, questioning human being. It is the dialectical dialogue between interpreting the world and changing the world. Einstein, with his desire to find an ultimate rational order, represents the pinnacle of the effort of consciousness. Marx, with his call to action, to overthrow an irrational social order, represents the pinnacle of the aspiration of practice. Today, in the 21st century, that dialogue is more urgent than ever. As artificial intelligence promises to liberate us from mental labor, but also threatens to create a new, more subtle form of alienation. As the climate crisis reveals the contradiction between the immense productive forces of capitalism and the very natural foundations of life. As global inequality reaches unimaginable levels and the class struggle no longer takes place within a single nation. But on a planetary scale, Marx's philosophy is not a collection of ready-made answers. It is not a religious dogma. It is a method, a tool for asking questions, a living worldview for analyzing the contradictions of our time. It invites us, just as Marx invited Einstein, to pull our gaze down from the abstract stars to the naked earth of social relations, so that from there we can look back up at the stars with a new meaning, a new purpose. Whenever I sit in my study at night, looking out at the city lights and the glittering stars above, I imagine that encounter, and I realize that the dialogue is not over. It is waiting for us, each of us, to write the next part, with our thoughts and with our actions, because, after all, the golden tree of life is evergreen, and history is still waiting for our answer.